And there is that storm system starting to ebb away and the isobars just slowly opening out. So the winds will continue to ease through the rest of today, but it's still going to be a very windy day. For many, it'll be bright out there this afternoon. Quite a bit of cloud over the Midlands, East Anglia through the early afternoon. A few showers likely here, but otherwise it is mostly dry and many places seeing sunny spells. But it is still windy. Those winds just continuing to ease down a little bit through the afternoon. Temperature-wise, double digits for many across England and Wales, and even further north, above average across Scotland. But obviously it doesn't feel that mild because it is still very windy. As the winds ease off further, we could see some pockets of frost across northeast Scotland. Turns quite chilly across eastern England overnight with clear skies, but the next set of weather fronts will move in from the west, bringing rain and drizzle, and eventually they'll start to lift the temperatures. So certainly in the west, we're well above freezing by dawn, but some more heavy rain and strong winds coming to western Scotland in the morning. That rain will spread southwards, could be very heavy for a time across northwest England, North Wales, particularly through Tuesday morning's rush hour. That band of rain kind of eases off as it spreads southwards, so a spell of damp weather for the Midlands and then East Anglia in the southeast through the early afternoon before skies start to brighten and we see sunny spells. A few showers across western Scotland, in particular over the hills. There will be of snow here, but again, for many it turns quite bright, but still quite breezy in the afternoon. Through Tuesday evening, we'll see a few more of those showers coming into Northern Ireland, northwest England, particularly western Scotland, with more snow on the hills. Clearer spells further south, and the weather continuing to chop and change this week. It'll often be windy, but not as stormy. There'll be spells of rain, but also most of us will see some sunnier days as well. Goodbye.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Lots coming up this hour. We'll discuss the end of COVID restrictions in England. We'll get the latest on Ukraine and Russia developments. And we head to the Commons, where Defence Secretary Ben Wallace is set to give an update on the Russian aggression against Ukraine. All that and more to come, but first, here are your latest headlines with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon, it's just gone 3 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright here to keep you up to date on GB News. And some breaking news for you just now. The UK is going to offer an additional COVID-19 booster jab from the spring for the most vulnerable. People aged 75 years and over, residents in care homes for the elderly, and people aged 12 years and over who are immunosuppressed will be eligible. These groups will be able to receive their fourth jab from around 6 months after their last dose. The Health Secretary Sajid Javid said he accepted the advice from the Independent Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation and said that all 4 parts of the UK intend to follow the advice. A cabinet meeting in which Boris Johnson was due to outline his blueprint for living with COVID to his colleagues has been delayed until later today. Ministers had arrived at Number 10 ahead of the meeting, but it was postponed at short notice. The Prime Minister is expected to remove all remaining domestic COVID regulations in England by the end of this week, including mandatory isolation after a positive test. The British Medical Association said that would be an odd decision. Virologist Dr. Chris Smith says if restrictions change, people should be encouraged still to use common sense.
At the end of the day, if you've got gastroenteritis and norovirus, you generally don't go to work. You don't send your kid to nursery. There's no legal framework that says if you do, you're going to get prosecuted. That's what they're removing, the legal framework, but hopefully the learning, the common sense, the ability to make decisions and risk assess that we've actually become pretty good at doing over the course of the pandemic. That remains in play.
In other news now, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has opened a meeting to consider recognising the independence of 2 separatist regions in eastern Ukraine. The leaders of both the rebel-held Donetsk Republic and the Luhansk Republic have called on President Putin to recognise their independence. The Prime Minister's spokesman says intelligence suggests Russia intends to launch an invasion of Ukraine and that President Putin's plan has in effect already begun. The US President Joe Biden has agreed in principle to talks with Vladimir Putin as long as Russia holds off an attack. Andrei Kelin, Russia's ambassador to the UK, said that it was too soon to say whether the summit between the leaders could resolve the crisis.
All this is not about restoration of Russian empire. It is not about seizure of part of Ukrainian territory. We do not need it. We do not need such a burden at all. This is not about a geopolitical relocation of forces. Nothing about that. We simply need guarantees that further enlargement, there will be no further enlargement, which is threatening to us.
The Defence Secretary Ben Wallace is due to make a statement on Ukraine in the Commons shortly. He says Britain has made clear to Moscow that NATO's open door policy will not change.
Diplomacy is, we feel, the only way out of this crisis. We're working through NATO and OSCE, but Russia must uphold international commitments it freely enter into and respect Ukraine's sovereignty. Ukraine is part of Europe. Ukrainians consider themselves European, and it is absolutely the case that the ripples of anything that happens in Ukraine will be felt right across Europe, whether they are in NATO or not.
Of course, this is a developing story and we'll keep you up to date. Now, an investigation into childcare services in Solihull has found that some details were entered incorrectly into police databases, leaving children at risk of potential harm. The investigation was launched after 6-year-old Arthur Labinho Hughes was murdered in 2020. In a number of safeguarding cases, officers in Solihull were found to be over-optimistic and they lack professional curiosity. Investigators reported examples of separate records being made for the same individual because of spelling errors in their name and children not being linked on the system to family relatives who could pose a risk to them. Environment agencies have issued hundreds of alerts for flooding as Storm Franklin continues to sweep across the UK. It follows yellow weather warnings that have been in place since this morning but have now been removed. Transport networks have been suffering further delays, with some train operators asking passengers not to travel because of the conditions. 32,000 homes are still without power following Storm Eunice over the weekend. So there is a new drive to help uncover some of Britain's working class history. Historic England have announced that local communities can apply for grants of up to £25,000 to fund research. The aim is to find out more about everyday history in places like our railways, council estates and pubs. The project is the first of a series planned for the next 3 years, exploring the diversity of England's heritage. You are now up to date here on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's return to the briefing with Tom.
Welcome back to The Briefing. Coming up this hour, COVID curbs in England are set to be scrapped as the Prime Minister yesterday declared it a moment of pride for the country. Well, is it the right time to end all the curbs? We'll be discussing this in depth. And as the US President Joe Biden has agreed in principle to meet Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in a bid to talk him down from the brink of war, we'll bring you the latest on that situation. And as the Defence Secretary is set to address the House of Commons at 3:30 today, he updates MPs on the latest information from Ukraine amidst the crisis. We'll bring you that live, of course. Now, give me your political briefing. Don't forget to send in your views and opinions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk. We're looking forward to see what you have to say on the cost of testing, on Ukraine, and on anything else. Tweet me also at GB News. Well, good afternoon. It's 3:06 here on this Monday afternoon, and welcome to The Briefing. Now, Boris Johnson is this afternoon expected to announce his plan for living with COVID, with the Prime Minister set to tell MPs that the requirement to self-isolate after a positive test will be scrapped in England. The imminent announcement comes despite warnings from the Labour Party and some health bodies that the move may be premature and risks further case spikes and deaths. So, is this the right time for the Prime Minister to be scrapping these restrictions? And will it effectively mark the end of the pandemic? Well, our GB News reporter Will Hollis was in Nottingham earlier today, getting some reaction from the public.
It's time to move on because it's not going to go away. But on buses and enclosed environments, I think it's still a little bit uncomfortable for people. And even for myself, I feel a bit uncomfortable. But I'm vaccinated, so therefore I feel health-wise I'm okay, and we need to perhaps continue that moving on.
We have to live with the virus, but other thing, can we trust people not to infect other people? So it's a question of responsibility of other people. If they test positive or if they have symptoms, that they be very, very responsible. You know what I mean? So I think just throwing a blank canvas out there could be a bit of a wrong message. I think there should be somewhere where people should be responsible, you know what I mean? But we can't guarantee that.
You can't keep going on forever isolating, but then again, if you don't isolate, then we're going to go on forever, aren't we, sort of thing. So I don't know how to come to an arrangement with that, to be honest.
I think they should still keep the rules going. You should still have to wear your mask and that. Because I would not go anywhere without it, never do. And I think you should keep the rules going, really do.
It's dangerous, utterly dangerous. You don't know who's got it. I mean, do you go around with a big notice on, I've got COVID? No, you don't. You self-isolate, you take yourself away and look after it, after yourself. I've done it.
Well, of course, we need to wait until around 4:30 for the Prime Minister to announce exactly what is in that plan. But let's talk through some of the possibilities now with the political editor of the Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People, Nigel Nelson, and political commentator Connor Tomlinson. Welcome to the programme to you both. Nigel, let's start with you. There seems to have been a bit of a rift today between the Chancellor and the Health Secretary over testing and potentially surveillance and the cost versus, I suppose, the benefit. Nigel, what do you make of this rift and what do you think the expected outcome might be?
Well, it was quite extraordinary that the cabinet was delayed this morning, even as ministers were arriving for the meeting. You can understand why the Chancellor is balking at the idea of keeping tests going. We're giving them out at the moment at the rate of about 22 million a week, and that's costing the Chancellor a couple of billion a month. So obviously he doesn't want to carry on doing this. However, if you're going to get rid of the rule of the rule that says we've got to self-isolate having had a positive test, you still therefore need testing around. So it's the best way of discovering if we've got variants coming in. There are suggestions this afternoon that the ONS infection survey, which is very important for that, might be slimmed down, that community PCR testing might also be reduced. Now, all of that will stop us seeing variants coming into the country. And if people can't have their free tests, you're going to get a two-tier system where the rich will know that they've got COVID, and those on low incomes won't. And that's why it's so important. Now, we'll know at 4:30 when the Prime Minister stands up who won this particular argument, and whether or not Sajid Javid got the money from the Chancellor that he needs to keep this going.
Well, let's turn this to Conor Tomlinson now. Are we at risk of creating a two-tier society here, where the rich will know they've got COVID and the poor won't?
I don't think so at all. The idea that we can stop variants coming into the country hasn't happened over the course of the pandemic, of course, because by the time that one country has sequenced it, it turns out months back, there were cases of it, for example, with South Africa and Omicron, there were cases in Nigeria. By the time we put Nigeria on the travel red list, the cases had come through all the way back in October. And also, according to Professor Carl Hennigan of evidence-based medicine, he said that as long as, by the time most cases, I believe it's between a third and half of the cases of COVID throughout the pandemic, by the time that they've been caught, they've reached peak infection anyway. So if you've been out and about mingling, you've already done the damage of transmission. So I'd like to just know if we're going to keep testing, if we're going to do another booster jab offered to people now. Obviously, it's quite costly. I know 800,000 of those AstraZeneca jabs, etc., were binned because of the low take-up of the third booster. So it's still going to be at cost whether or not we just do treatments, jabs, tests, whatever. I'd like to know what more can we do? If you look at the government's report concerning deaths related to COVID for the last week 7 of 2022, the majority of people that died with COVID were triple jabbed. Now, that doesn't say the jab doesn't work, that doesn't say it's not worth it as a preventative measure, but it does say we can't stop COVID. Zero COVID is not a tenable policy, so we need to learn to live with it.
Yes, and I think, to be fair, no political party in the UK is now pursuing a vision of zero COVID. The Labour Party saying that there needs to be some greater surveillance, and I suppose the more libertarian wing of the Tory party saying, well, it's over, we've done it, let's go back to living our lives normally. I suppose there is that distinction, though, between a level of surveillance, as is done randomly by the ONS, a relatively cost-effective measure, versus the mass testing, which, of course, costs that $2 billion a day. That gruesome £37 billion budget total that so often is touted by people who say this is just too much to pay. Many who criticised the £37 billion budget are ironically now criticising the idea that testing may no longer be free. Nigel, do you see a distinction between the ONS surveillance versus the individualised mass testing?
Well, they're both going hand in hand. And it's absolutely right. You can't stop variants getting into the country. But what we need to know is whether they're here or not. And the whole point about testing is that actually gives you an indication that there is a variant around. Now, take the Omicron variant. Fortunately, it wasn't as serious as it turned out to be, although I've just come out of a bout of it last week, and it was quite unpleasant, really. But at the moment, it's that even the Omicron variant has now mutated. So we have a new version which is dominant in Northern Ireland. 1 in 5 people in England and Scotland are now testing for this new mutation, and it probably will become the dominant one. And because of the testing, we actually know what is going on. So if you start reducing that, you won't be able to find out what is happening. So, no, it is absolutely right. We can't stop these things getting in, but what we can do is know that they're here, and the only way of doing that is to have proper testing.
So, Conor, in your view, is it that we should have no testing at all, or what would you say is the optimum strategy here? Is there a halfway house that can be met between Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid?
Well, I think the halfway house is going to be met in hospitals because currently Omicron is not a severe variant. I'm going to appropriate the words of a man who I'd never thought I'd paraphrase, Bill Gates, in saying that we're blessed that it's a natural vaccine. But if a variant becomes worse, if a lot of people become hospitalized, you're going to be tested in hospital. And might I remind you that most of the tests that we're scrapping are going to be lateral flow tests. They just tell you with a varying reliability rate whether you have COVID or not a specific variant. If you go to a hospital, you will probably be a PCR test. It will be sequenced, and the hospitals themselves will be able to tell if there's a new variant, if it's deadlier, etc. Until then, we've got Omicron. Lots of people have antibodies. It seems that the antibody resistance works. Just get on with it like any other respiratory virus.
I suppose that is a fair point there. The lateral flow tests, I mean, I found them to be absolutely brilliant. They caught my COVID when I got back from the United States at the end of last year. And without that lateral flow test, actually, because the PCR didn't pick it up in time, I don't think I'd have been isolating. I probably would have infected a lot of people. But it's right that these tests, these lateral flow tests, don't sequence. And in the last figures I saw, they cost $9 billion a year. And that was for year one, before they were being given out at such a rate. So, Nigel, in your view, do lateral flow tests potentially are they not as useful as those PCRs?
Well, I mean, clearly it's the PCR you need to actually do the sequencing. So it's perfectly true. All the lateral flow is going to tell you is whether or not you have COVID. But this is what comes back then to, this is where these things go hand in hand. What we're talking about now is ending the legal requirement to isolate if you have COVID. That means all of us will have to use our common sense about what we do. But at the moment, without the lateral flow, you won't even know necessarily you've got COVID. You might feel a bit off or whatever. But until you can actually test yourself, you can't find out if you've got it. And if you do have it, the sensible thing to do will be to isolate as you would have done whether the law mandates it or not. And the problem is by getting rid of it, those who can afford it, and they'll cost about £30 for a box of 7, those of the people who can afford it, will be able to carry on testing as they are now. Those who can't afford it won't. And so you've got people who are on really low incomes already because of the cost of living crisis facing a choice between heating and eating. Now they'll have to make a third choice. Do they try and look after their health by getting some tests in, or do they go without? And the big danger is they'll go without.
Well, let's turn now in our final minute of this conversation to the wider political context here. Of course, the accusation against the Prime Minister is that this has been brought forward a month early due to the political situation he faces. And of course, we've got the Met Police investigation and the local elections running up the 5th of May, so not too far ahead in the future. Connor, in your view, how safe is the Prime Minister?
Oh, I believe it's going to be either we've passed the whimper or a bang stage, and now it seems to be very much the whimper. I don't think Partygate is going to have much of an impact on the May elections, actually. I think the major hit jobs the press could have done, I don't think hit jobs isn't the right word, actually. It's fair to excoriate the Prime Minister for locking us in our homes for 2 years and then, parting the night away, etc., because he's the one that set the rules. But I think most people are so unbothered by it. I mean, there's plenty of people that have emailed into GBNews now saying, oh, you're just Boris bashing because they're hoping he gets on with the job. I think actually it's him getting on with the job and not doing a very good job that's going to sink his ship when it comes to May. The cost of living crisis has come in. I was on the breakfast show yesterday talking about how I may not be able to buy a home well into my late 30s at this rate because of the rent rates going up, because of a historic low in houses on the market in December. £693 is about to hit in April per household for energy bills on average. It might be higher. So if people see that about a month before they're electing, maybe there might be another Conservative MP in my constituency, I think most of them, like the Conservative voters in Bexley in my constituency, won't even vote at all. They'll probably just stay home, and you'll see sweeping victories for various different parties in the local constituencies.
Does seem that is a pertinent risk for the Prime Minister. Final word to you, Nigel. May elections, how safe is the Prime Minister?
I don't think he's safe at all. I'm not sure he'll even make it to May. And certainly the Partygate will have an effect on that. I mean, at the end of the day, the Prime Minister's future is in the hands of his own MPs. They will decide whether they're going to oust him. And I think that the next stage is going to be when the police come back and say whether or not the PM's getting £100 fine.
Well, it'll be certainly fascinating to see. Number 10 have, of course, said that they will announce if the Prime Minister gets a fixed penalty notice, but we don't know when that might be, if it is to come at all, of course. Well, for now, thank you very much, Nigel Nelson, political editor of the Sunday Mirror and Sunday People, and political commentator Connor Tomlinson for talking through those issues there. Really fascinating. Well, after the break, we'll be getting the latest on Russia and Ukraine as those tensions continue to rise. But before that, let's have a look at just how bad the weather is outside.
Hello. The winds are easing as Storm Franklin clears away, but there's going to be some heavy rain around, certainly for a time tomorrow, before we see brighter skies generally through the afternoon. There's Franklin disappearing, and we've got a brief bump in the isobars, a brief ridge before this next weather system comes in, and it'll be that brings some heavy rain during tomorrow. For many, though, it'll be dry and fine through this evening. The winds continuing to ease down, still quite gusty on the east coast, but even here the winds ease through the night. Some patches of frost over northeast Scotland with some clearer skies before that next set of weather fronts arrive, bringing cloud and patchy rain initially, but then some heavy rain to western Scotland and Northern Ireland by dawn. And the winds will pick up once more in the northwest. Temperatures mostly holding up above freezing, but as I said, through this evening we could see some pockets of frost. Certainly tomorrow morning, that rain is going to be heavy across initially southern Scotland, but then spreading into northern England and Wales, easing a little as it spreads over the Midlands, and then just turning things damp across East Anglia and the southeast around the early afternoon. Clearing away and then leaving sunny spells and just a few scattered showers, which will be of snow over the hills in Scotland. Temperatures 8, 9 across the north, 10, 11 further south. Breezy, but nothing like as windy as today. During Tuesday evening, again, clear skies will allow it to turn quite cold for a time before we see another weather front, bringing more rain and strong winds back across Scotland, again with a bit of snow likely on the hills here. And that rain will only slowly creep southwards during Wednesday, spreading into Northern Ireland and eventually Northern England. For most of England and Wales, though, it'll be dry on Wednesday, just a few showers for Wales and the southwest. Some sunny spells across the east. It will be windy, though, so the temperature's 8, 9, 10 Celsius, but feeling colder with that wind on Wednesday. And through the rest of this week, it stays pretty lively. Gusty winds, but not as stormy. Some further spells of rain, but also some sunnier days as well.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and every weekday we bring you The Briefing live from 9:30 a.m. The stories, analysis, and live debate that you need to hear.
Quite right, Tom, of course.
Was this something that had been considered at all?
Difficult to answer.
Gas-guzzling helicopters circling. noise is being made here. Joe Biden walking out. Thank you very much for joining us.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, Monday to Friday, 9:30 a.m. on GB News.
Join me, Gloria De Piero, Monday to Thursday at noon for The Briefing. We go to the parts of Parliament that you won't see elsewhere. Plus, there's exclusive interviews with MPs from all parties.
But quite often, they paper over the real truth. Why does a working class lad like you join the Tories?
That's a good question.
Don't miss it. Monday to Thursdays at noon on GB News.
Welcome back to The Briefing. It is 3:25 and you're watching me, Tom Harwood. Now, Number 10 has suggested this afternoon that President Putin has, in effect, already began to act on his plan to invade Ukraine. This comes as US President Joe Biden has agreed, in principle, to hold a summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin to discuss the crisis over Ukraine. Now, these talks proposed by France will only take place if Russia does not invade its neighbour, the White House has said. Meanwhile, the Kremlin said there were no concrete plans for a summit. Well, earlier today, US officials said it had credible information that Russian forces are creating lists of Ukrainians to be killed or sent into camps in the event of a military occupation. Well, let's discuss all of this now with Theo Normanton, a journalist from Moscow. Welcome to the programme. Now, I want to start with this extraordinary Security Council meeting that Vladimir Putin has been holding today. It's been broadcast on Russian television, which is pretty extraordinary. A meeting of government officials being broadcast as if it's some kind of soap opera. First of all, Theo, can you talk us through exactly what's been going on?
Yes, well, we've definitely seen an escalation in the rhetoric and also the mobilizations around the Russian-Ukrainian crisis at the moment. That's been over the last couple of days, but it's definitely reaching a fever pitch now. On Friday, the Ukrainian army reported 60 different infringements of the peace process in the Donbass region, and Russia is also accusing the Ukrainian military of shelling and targeting critical infrastructure in the area. So it's quite difficult at the moment to extricate truth from untruth and to establish the facts because it's a time of high rhetoric. Russia's also been conducting military exercises in conjunction with Belarus, and we recently heard Belarus saying that it's going to allow 30,000 Russian troops to stay there permanently. So it's quite a tense time, but it does look like the door to diplomacy is still open, with Foreign Secretary of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, planning to meet the American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, later this week.
Lavrov has not been the kindest towards his Western counterparts over the last couple of weeks. It's not easy to forget the derogatory words which he used to the UK Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss. I wonder, are people going to take what the Kremlin says at its word now that we can see clearly there have been advances towards a state of war, more troops on the border of Ukraine, when at the start of last week, the Kremlin was briefing out that they were withdrawing, that they'd completed their exercises and that they were retreating. That's now just going to be seen the whole world over as a lie now, isn't it?
Well, I don't think the Kremlin has said that that's not the case now. I think it still says that it's de-escalating and moving troops away from the border. What's not clear is where it's moving those troops to, and whether it's a simple redeployment to different areas of the border. The Kremlin's also been saying that lots of refugees have been coming into Russia from the Donbass region, and it's difficult to say from where I am whether that's true or false because I'm not on the front line. So, yeah, it's definitely a period of uncertainty, and it is difficult to establish the facts right now. As for the question of whether people will take the Kremlin at its word, I think it probably depends on the people in question, whether we're talking about people who are consuming exclusively Russian media, exclusively Western media, or a mix of the two?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt you there and end this interview prematurely because Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State for Defence, is on his feet in the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I would like to update the House on the latest situation regarding Russia's actions towards Ukraine. As at 900 hours today, there are now more than 110 battalion tactical groups massed around Ukraine's borders with Russia and Belarus. In addition, in the Black Sea Fleet, there are 2 amphibious groups, 9 cruise missile-equipped Russian ships, and a further 4 cruise missile-capable vessels in the Caspian Sea. In the last 48 hours, contrary to Kremlin assurances, we have seen a continued increase in troop numbers and a change in force disposition, moving from holding areas to potential launch locations. All the indicators point to increasing numbers and readiness of Russian forces, and not surprising to many of us, the pledge to withdraw Russian troops from Belarus at the end of their joint military drills on the 20th of February was not carried out, and the exercise has now been extended until further notice. Complementing this troop build-up has been the proliferation of false flag operations, propaganda stunts, and Russian news outlets carrying fictitious allegations. These are not the actions of a Russian government fulfilling its repeated declarations that it has no intention of invading Ukraine. In fact, we have seen over the last few weeks the Russian playbook being implemented in a way that gives a strong cause for concern that President Putin is still committed to an invasion. I believe he is in danger of setting himself on a tragic course of events leading to a humanitarian crisis, instability, and widespread suffering, not just of Ukrainians, but also of the Russian people. Russians, like many of us, know the consequences of military interventions. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the First War in Chechnya. These are just 2 of the examples that Russia faced where too many young men returned home in zinc-lined coffins. And the government therefore urges President Putin, for the sake of his own people and even at this 11th hour, to rule out the invasion of Ukraine and recommit to a diplomatic process for us to address the perceptions of the Kremlin. Over recent weeks, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, and I have engaged in numerous engagements with our international counterparts, including my own visit to Moscow to meet with Defence Minister Shoigu and General Valery Gerasimov. We have made clear our determination to uphold the defensive principles of NATO and to defend the right of sovereign countries to make choices about their own security arrangements. As the Russian government itself has signed up to, states, and I quote, have an equal right to security. We reaffirm the inherent right of each and every participating state to be free to choose or change its security arrangements, including treaties or alliances. That statement, Mr. Speaker, was signed by the Russians in 1975 in the Helsinki Final Act, in 1995 in the Budapest Summit Declaration, in 1999 in the Istanbul Summit, and most lately in 2010 at the Astana Summit. We urge Russia to stick to its commitments that it has openly made and signed up to over the years. My counterpart, Minister Shoigu, repeated to me in person that Russia has no intention of invading Ukraine, and while we will take them at their word, we must judge them by their actions. At our meeting, I also took the opportunity to address the proposals in Russia's draft treaty, because while this is not a return to normal UK relations, it is important that as one of Europe's biggest military powers, the UK maintains strong lines of communications with Russia in order to avoid miscalculation or the risk of inadvertent escalations. I also continue to speak regularly to my Ukrainian defence counterpart, Minister Reznikov, as we continue to support the armed forces of Ukraine. Since 2015, the UK has responded alongside the likes of Sweden and Canada to Russia's previous illegal occupation of Crimea with defence capability building, including training and reform. And as I announced to the House last month, Mr. Speaker, we took the decision to also provide lethal aid to Ukraine. This now means that alongside the United States, Canada, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania and the Netherlands, the United Kingdom has not just spoken but acted. I'm pleased with the efforts being made by a range of European leaders, including President Macron, to find a way through, as we must remain resolute in our commitment to NATO's formal response to the Russian draft treaties, which all NATO members signed up to. Intimidation and aggression, however, must not be rewarded. We should be under no illusion. The Russian forces have now massed on Ukraine's borders 65% of all their land combat power. The formation present and the action of the Russian state to date not only threaten the integrity of a sovereign state, but undermine international law and the democratic values in which all of us in Europe so strongly believe. The Foreign Office has now relocated the embassy further west in the country, and as 2 weeks ago advised all UK nationals should leave Ukraine via all means possible. The Ministry of Defence will continue to monitor Russian actions, support Ukrainian defensive efforts and contribute to NATO's response measures. We continue to hope, Mr. Speaker, President Putin will relent and pull back from an invasion, but we must prepare ourselves for the consequences if he does not. I will update the House as I have done so over the last few weeks, both in the Chamber and to colleagues online. Thank you.
Now come to Shadow Secretary of State, John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Defence Secretary has been busy in recent weeks, so I welcome his statement today. Can I also thank him for keeping the opposition parties updated on Ukraine during these very grave escalations of Russian military threats on the Ukrainian border. This is the most serious security crisis Europe has faced since the Cold War, and the Ukrainian people, citizens of a proud, independent and democratic country, face an utterly unprecedented threat from, as the Secretary has said, 2/3 of Russia's entire forces built up now on its borders. Mr. Speaker, there is unified UK political support for Ukraine's sovereignty and its territorial integrity in the face of this continuing Russian aggression. The government also has Labour's full support in helping Ukraine defend itself and in pursuing diplomacy, even at this 11th hour, and even though President Putin has proved more interested in disinformation than diplomacy. And we also fully support moves to reinforce the security of NATO allies, as the Labour leader and I told the Secretary-General at NATO HQ earlier this month. Mr. Speaker, President Putin wants to divide and weaken the West, to turn back the clock and re-establish Russian control over neighbouring countries. The real threat to President Putin and his Russian elites is Ukraine as a successful democracy, choosing for itself its trading and security links with the West. An attack on Ukraine is an attack on democracy. So we welcome the message from Munich at the weekend that any invasion will be met with massive sanctions in a swift, unified Western response. The European Union, of course, will lead on sanctions legislation for most European allies, especially to clamp down on finances or critical technologies for Russia. So how is the UK coordinating with the European Commission and Council? What meetings have UK ministers had to discuss this coordination? Mr. Speaker, the other message from Munich at the weekend was that allies stand ready for further talks, and the Defence Secretary has said this afternoon, I am pleased with the efforts being made by a range of European leaders, including President Macron. But what diplomatic initiatives is our UK Prime Minister taking, befitting Britain as a leading member of the NATO alliance and a permanent member of the UN Security Council? With the most serious tensions and developments in the Donbass, why did the UK government remove UK staff from the OSCE monitoring mission there, when those from all other European countries have stayed to do a job which is more vital now than ever? The Defence Secretary said quite rightly, we continue to support Ukrainian defensive efforts, including with lethal aid. So what more will the Defence Secretary now do with NATO to help Ukraine defend itself? Can he speed up action via the Ukraine naval agreement? How feasible is a no-fly zone? What consideration will he give to support for Ukrainian resistance? Mr. Speaker, we cannot stand up to Russian aggression abroad while accepting Russian corruption at home. For too long, Britain has been the destination for the dirty money that keeps Putin in power. So where is the economic crime bill, promised by the government and then pulled? Where is the comprehensive reform of Companies House? Where is the law to register foreign agents? Where is the Register of Overseas Entities bill? Where is the replacement for the outdated Computer Misuse Act? Where are the new rules on political donations? Why does the government's elections bill make these problems worse by enabling political donations from donors based overseas? Whether or not President Putin invades Ukraine, Russia's long-run pattern of aggression demands a NATO response. So can the Secretary of State report from his meeting last week with NATO defence ministers on how the alliance's overall posture is set to change? Can he explain what could be taken to better coordinate NATO with the Joint Expeditionary Force, for instance, creating a regional readiness force? And finally, does Ukraine not expose the flaws in the government's integrated review last year, with its first focus on the Indo-Pacific and with its plan to cut the British Army by another 10,000 soldiers? Will he now halt any further army cuts, and will he restore the highest defence priority to Europe, the North Atlantic and the Arctic?
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman's support, and he will know that throughout this process we are grateful in the government, but also efforts to be united across this House has been one of the strongest messages we can send to Russia, as is we are united across NATO and indeed the EU to make sure that their behaviour is unacceptable. When the Right Honourable Gentleman asked about sanctions, my Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has been in conversation more than weekly with the EU on coordinating sanctions to make sure the EU Commission, who is obviously the lead on their sanctions, the United States and the United Kingdom are as close as possible in lockstep. The EU have obviously currently taken the position that they will prepare and deliver the sanctions should an invasion happen at that moment. The United States and certainly the United Kingdom has laid before this House their sanctions that they would put in place. That is a different of approach. However, we know from our own experience that the EU can move very quickly at a Commission level when it wishes to do so. And there is no loss of appetite or lack of appetite in the EU to deal with President Putin through sanctions should he make the tragic error of invading Ukraine. And I don't think anyone should play into the differences of timing to suggest that. It is just a simple mechanism of approach. My Right Honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, also through a group called the Quint++, that is the US, UK, Italy, France and Germany, plus NATO and the EU, are all working together on those type of responses, and they are regularly having discussions. On the issue of OSCE, I can get the exact, I will write to the Right Honourable Gentleman about it, but I know that one individual has been in touch. He is obviously a UK citizen, and when the Foreign Office advice was issued, there are certain, obviously, advices to citizens of our country, and if you find yourself in any organisation, obviously, that is our advice to them. However, other members of the OSCE have left, not all of them, but I will get him the full details as well. When it comes to the bigger questions of issues like aid, Ukrainian resistance and further support, he will know that it is being best pursued in a bilateral basis between countries or groupings of countries, such as through lethal aid. There's been much made of the fact that countries such as Germany and France have not done lethal aid to Ukraine. I simply reflect, as I did at NATO last week, that the strength of an alliance of 30 is we can all play to our strengths. That is important, that we recognise that not every country in their political systems or their political leadership is going to have the same view, but as an alliance of 30, we can play to our strengths and we can deliver to Ukraine what it needs. And we've seen, for example, an increase in aid to Ukraine from the likes of Germany, as well as medical supplies. And in other countries such as the United Kingdom and the Baltic states, obviously lethal aid plays a part of that. And I think that's really important, Mr. Speaker, in order to keep going together at the same speed. We recognise that if we're going to tackle Russia, we have to be able to play to that strength. The EU has a strong role to play in helping the resilience of neighbouring countries, such as through migrant flows in Belarus, etc. If 1 million refugees appear in Hungary or Romania or Poland, I would urge the EU needs to step up and think about what it's going to do about millions of refugees on their soil, rather than think about it afterwards. And I think that's where the EU Commission can play a strong role in resilience building. In other areas, his comment on the integrated review. Look, I actually think it's the opposite. If you read the full integrated review and the Defence Command paper, what it showed was we have to be ready. And what it shows is that Russia and adversaries like Russia, they don't go with a big bang and just arrive in a big invasion. They soften up their targets using sub-threshold methods in cyber, in corruption, in organised crime, etc. And they turn up incrementally. Many of the forces that we see now massed on Ukraine's border were in fact pre-positioned in April following an exercise, and then their troops went home to barracks. That allowed them to be ready and to deploy in days, while NATO's traditional model has been weeks and months for us to deploy. That's why in our Defence Command paper we put a premium on speed and readiness, and if sometimes that premium means a less mass, that's why we have an alliance to pick up on that. We have an alliance of 30 countries. We way outspend Russia collectively as a group of nations and indeed capabilities, and it's why I'm now able to offer our NATO leaders true forces that will actually turn up on the day, rather than what we had even in my day when I was serving in West Germany or North Germany, which was fictional numbers, but actually when you press the button, instead of a division, you got a brigade. And I think that is far more important to show strength to the Russians that we mean what we say and we can deliver on that. I was Security Minister, Mr. Speaker, when I introduced the Criminals Finance Act. There was no more greater champion on taking down dirty money in the city than me. I brought in the unexplained wealth orders. I brought in the mobile stores of wealth where people got round it, and in fact helped set up the national, within the National Crime Agency, the Economic Crime Unit. I also made sure that we changed the law around tax evasion to make sure we got more people, and pushed incredibly hard and successfully through the, I think it was the G7, the Transparent Register of Beneficial Ownership. He's absolutely right, we need to do more. I absolutely supported at the time and still do a register of foreign agents, and I am, the whole of government is now looking at those issues, and I think he is totally right around areas like Companies House. The government is committed to do something about it. I expect an announcement soon on a range of those issues, but he's right that the consequences of Russia's action, going way back to Salisbury and before, is that we must stop the oligarchs and their dirty money resident in this country behaving as a place of refuge when in fact they should not be welcome. And if it comes to an invasion of Ukraine, Russia should know what it costs to be isolated.
Theresa May.
Speaker, can I commend my right honourable friend and the government for the robust stance which they have been taking alongside our American and European allies in the face of Russia's threats against Ukraine. President Putin wants to weaken NATO and the Western alliance, but does my right honourable friend agree with me that any further action to invade Ukrainian territory by the Russians can only lead to a strengthening of the determination of the UK, NATO and the Western alliance to defend the rights of sovereign states and to defend democracy?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and I have to say, when I was her security minister, it was her support that allowed us to sometimes overrule the Treasury to get some of those legislations through to deal with the Criminal Finances Act. My right honourable friend is absolutely right. In 2014, after the invasion of Crimea, President Putin got exactly the opposite of what he wanted. He got more forces on the east of Europe, he got more defence spending. If he continues down this line, I suspect he'll continue to get more forces on his border and greater defence spending across NATO, the very opposite of what he is trying to intend to do. I hope he learns a lesson of 2015. At the moment, it's not looking well. Good.
SNP spokesperson Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary for advance sight of the statement and the updates he's been giving opposition parties over the previous weeks, and underline that on these benches we are friends of Ukraine, we are supporters of international law, and we support absolutely Ukraine's right and ability to organise its security affairs as it sees fit. But as the Russian Security Council meeting happening as we've been sat in this chamber this afternoon shows us, we have reached a dangerous moment in all of this. The Secretary has mentioned the new sanctions package that was announced by the government just before the recess. And when that package was announced, it stated, quote, that it will give the government the ability to sanction entities and individuals of economic and strategic interest to Russia, but only if there is a further escalation. Well, that escalation has started, Mr. Speaker, and we saw that yesterday, Saturday and on Friday, anyone who was following events in the Donbass region. So isn't it time to start sanctioning individuals and entities of strategic interest now, including those here in this country? And given the importance that disinformation and the entire architecture that the Russian government has to spread disinformation to the conflict it's perpetrating against Ukraine, shouldn't that start with some of those disinformation rackets here, the likes of RT, Sputnik and others, now?
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right, and I think the new leader of Alba may like to reflect on his celebrity status on some of those channels. I think what I would say to the honourable gentleman is the government already does have some considerable powers. The Magnitsky sanctions that have been used against a number of Russian individuals after Salisbury. In fact, some of the people I met in the Russian Ministry of Defence themselves were sanctioned under a range of those measures, and we do continue to deliver them. But on the wider response, the whole of government will produce a response to this House in due course. I understand his point about should we not do sanctions now rather than wait for it to happen. I think that the key here is that we have to be in a position to threaten to deliver sanctions against Russia if they do something. If we were to unilaterally deliver them now, and America wasn't and European Union wasn't, I think there is a danger that President Putin would play into a divide and rule narrative that he is trying to do. I think that there are plenty of measures we can take. We are planning some serious set of sanctions, and I think that the reality and the question to President Putin is, do you actually care what's going to happen to your people? Because it will be them that suffers most as a result of the sanctions, and it will be interesting, as a responsible leader, whether he will listen to that.
Turn the Select Committee to Selden.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, could I welcome this statement? The penny was dropping at the Munich Security Conference that this is not just about Ukraine, but a wider realignment of global power, with the formation of a new Russia-China alliance that is fueling Putin's adventurism and indeed perhaps taking us towards another Cold War. The money laundering issues aside, which must go ahead, absolutely, could I ask the Secretary of State to look at the issues of sanctions? Because there is a concern we are actually helping Putin in his intention of turning Russia away from the West and towards a new alliance with China in the long-term future.
If Russia wants to be dependent on China, then I think they will recognise that will be a wrong decision. China and Russia are directly in competition over the high north and the route through the Arctic, and Russia surely will not want to depend entirely on China in the same way many European states are regretting being entirely dependent on Russian gas. I think it's important, however, that we do a range of sanctions that not only are directed at the regime and the government of Russia, but also at some of their bankers or their people that help them carry on as normal.
Ben Bradshaw.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I fully support what the Defence Secretary said and the response of the Shadow Defence Secretary. But as the architect of unexplained wealth orders, he must share the widespread frustration that not a single one has been issued.
Well, let's pull out of Labour's Ben Bradshaw there to discuss a little bit about what has been said by the Defence Secretary, the Chair of the Defence Select Committee, the former Prime Minister and the Shadow Defence Secretary over the last few minutes. Mark White, the GB News Home Affairs and Security Editor, is with us in the studio now. Mark, your first impressions?
Well, I think to take from this the real concern that they have, that there appears to be no sign that Russia is doing anything than continuing with its plans to launch some kind of an offensive against Ukraine. Of course, they still continue with the diplomatic channels. You've got President Biden trying to arrange this summit with Vladimir Putin, but it appears thus far to be falling on deaf ears. So there's some real concern going ahead. But there, just latterly, we've heard about this need to warn Russia yet again that if it does go ahead with any kind of military action, then it will face the most severe economic sanctions. And that is what we've heard the last few speakers really emphasising, and the need to go after the oligarchs and the dirty money that's coming into this country.
Is there a bit of a worry here that the West starts to sound a bit impotent in the face of Russia? Russia is not a particularly big or rich economy. Its economy is smaller than that of Italy, far smaller than that of the UK. And yet they've been able to beat around the leaders of the free world over the last few weeks. Do our politicians not sound a little impotent where they're pleading yet again and again for Russia to hear this message? Do we not need to be a bit more muscular?
Well, the difficulty in being a bit more muscular is that then you head down the road towards some kind of a conflict with a very heavily armed nuclear power. That is why, of course, Ukraine, not being a member of NATO, is not going to get any direct military help from the UK, the US and any other NATO allies. What it is getting is some military spend to put hardware in the form of anti-tank missiles and training and the like in place. But when it comes to the actual battle, if that's what we're faced with, Britain's out of there. Other countries are not going to be helping. All they will be doing, as we heard there again in the exchanges, is help bolster the NATO allies in the region to deal with what they expect could be hundreds of thousands, 1 million or more refugees spilling out of Ukraine.
It's a deeply concerning situation, one that we will be following all afternoon here on GB News. That's it for the briefing. Be sure to watch Brazier next, where he'll be bringing you more live from the House of Commons.
Hello. The winds are easing as Storm Franklin clears away, but there's going to be some heavy rain around, certainly for a time tomorrow, before we see brighter skies generally through the afternoon. There's Franklin disappearing, and we've got a brief bump in the isobars, a brief ridge before this next weather system comes in, and it'll be that brings some heavy rain during tomorrow. For many, though, it'll be dry and fine through this evening. The winds continuing to ease down, still quite gusty on the east coast, but even here the winds ease through the night. Some patches of frost over northeast Scotland with some clearer skies before that next set of weather fronts arrive, bringing cloud and patchy rain initially, but then some heavy rain to western Scotland and Northern Ireland by dawn. And the winds will pick up once more in the northwest. Temperatures mostly holding up above freezing, but as I said, through this evening we could see some pockets of frost. Certainly tomorrow morning, that rain is going to be heavy across initially southern Scotland, but then spreading into northern England and Wales, easing a little as it spreads over the Midlands, and then just turning things damp across East Anglia and the southeast around the early afternoon. Clearing away and then leaving sunny spells and just a few scattered showers, which will be of snow over the hills in Scotland. Temperatures 8, 9 across the north, 10, 11 further south. Breezy, but nothing like as windy as today. During Tuesday evening, again, clear skies will allow it to turn quite cold for a time before we see another weather front, bringing more rain and strong winds back across Scotland, again with a bit of snow likely on the hills here. And that rain will only slowly creep southwards during Wednesday, spreading into Northern Ireland and eventually Northern England. For most of England and Wales, though, it'll be dry on Wednesday, just a few showers for Wales and the southwest. Some sunny spells across the east. It will be windy, though, so the temperature's 8, 9, 10 Celsius, but feeling colder with that wind on Wednesday. And through the rest of this week, it stays pretty lively. Gusty winds, but not as stormy. Some further spells of rain, but also some sunnier days as well.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you dare